If you've paid extra for grass-fed and the steak still ate like any other steak you bought at the grocery store, or it came out chewy, well, you're not crazy. Grass-fed and grass-finished are not the same thing. And I'll show you the difference and give you a simple plan to buy and cook beef that actually delivers. Today, we'll keep this conversation straightforward and practical. In a few minutes, you'll know exactly how grass-fed on a label can still include grain finishing, why grass-finished tastes different, and how to buy and cook grass-finished so your family actually loves it. Let's start by defining some terms. All cattle eat grass at some point, and that may be out on a pasture, it may be stored hay. That's the start for cattle, and it happens pretty soon after they're born. Even while they're still nursing their mothers and drinking the milk from their mothers, those cows are starting to eat grass. They're starting to eat their forage. But what does that mean in terms of grass-fed versus grass-finished? Let's start with grass-fed, and I'm going to use grass-fed as it's most commonly used. That may mean that the animal ate grass, forage, for much of its life. But what it doesn't tell you is how that animal was finished. And that animal that ate forage for most of its life could just as easily be finished on grain as it could be finished on grass. And most likely, if all you're seeing on a label is grass-fed, that's probably an indication that they're simply referring to the pre-finishing phases of that animal's life where it was out on pasture or eating hay. Once you get to the finishing side of that, which is really what's going to impact the market weight, the quality of the meat, the marbling of the meat may be better stated here, that is often going to be a byproduct of grain exposure. And keep in mind that when you look at these labels around grass-fed, they're not uniform. There's no standardized definition here. And I've noticed that when I see a lot of these labels that are using grass-fed, what I don't see on these labels, which is really telling you the full story here, is that there's not a certifying agency to validate that grass finishing component and for grass-fed to actually mean what it was originally intended to mean. What grass-fed was originally intended to mean versus how that term is now being used and what it means in most scenarios are not the same thing. At a minimum, when you see grass-fed, for that to truly be a grass-fed animal from start to finish, there should be some certifying agency that validates that. If you don't see that, then the terminology around grass-fed is frankly, well, it's worthless. It's just words with no meaning. What you really are looking for, most likely if you're watching this video, is grass finished. Now, that is forage only. That is all that that animal has had other than the mother's milk that it had when it was going through its early stages of development in those first few months. When it's on its mother, though, it's still eating grass out in the pastures or even hay. It's still using hay. But that more specifically means that there is no grain anywhere in this finishing process. This animal hasn't been exposed to grain from start to finish. And these animals are raised under very strict programs. They're raised under very strict standards, and you have to adhere to those. That's what we adhere to at Harvest Hills Ranch. So I know what this looks like. And what you, as the consumer, when you're looking at that, you can actually do a little bit of investigative work with just your eyes, especially if you're looking at cuts of meat. So, for example, roast and steaks. You would expect that a grass-finished steak, it could be a little bit leaner. It could have a leaner profile to it. You may not see as much marbling in that meat. And especially when you eat it, you may know that there's a bit of a difference in the flavor or the texture of it. It has more of a, like the true beef flavor, the true notes of beef are what you're going to experience on that. And that can be influenced by seasonal variations. It can be influenced by the pastures that the animals are raised on. So there's no across the board one size fits all flavor profile that we're looking at here. And so you may notice that from one grass finished steak to another grass finished steak or other cut, that you may see some differences there in those grass finished animals that you don't inherently see in a grain finished animal. But to the bigger point of our conversation today, if you're really looking for grass finished and you're just going to look at labels, it has to say grass finished on there. It can't just say grass fed unless it's also going to come with a certifying agency label on there as well. The grass fed, even if it says 100% grass fed, that does not mean anything without the certifying agency on there to validate that. And you will find that many individuals, and again, I'll just use the example of Harvest Hills Ranch, we don't work with those certifying agencies. Working with those certifying agencies comes at a pretty steep cost. And so, frankly, it's just not worth it. I had rather be transparent with consumers, with customers, and just show them how we operate, let them see our operation firsthand and validate it with their own eyes, which is always more impactful and more, again, transparent than any label ever has the potential to be. Now, this is not the only difference, though. There's not just differences in definitions here in the rearing process. There are some other differences that you want to know. So if we're truly doing a grass-fed versus grass-finished, then what other differences should we be thinking about here? Well, another one that's going to come to mind is going to be the taste and the texture. The taste and the texture are going to be different. It doesn't mean one is good and one is bad. They're just different. When it comes to flavor, grass finished is going to be leaner. It's going to have again, that cleaner, more true beef flavor to it. Some might call it a more savory, taste profile that they're experiencing there, because again, you're getting the true beef notes on this. And many times grain finished animals they're not going to have the same flavor. You get a bit more of a fat flavor in there, which there can be a savoriness to that too, but it's going to be more of the fat component to it. Some may talk about it as being a sweeter, more buttery flavor to it, just because you've got more intramuscular fat, you've got more marbling in that meat, so that will influence it. The fat content's going to influence that. But then there's also the texture that's going to be a bit different as well. Now, don't confuse texture with being tough. That's not the same thing. When you look at grass finished, it is usually a leaner animal. So you have to keep that in mind when it comes to when you're cooking the meat and you're trying to define when is it done? When have I cooked it enough? And even after you've cooked it and you've taken it off of say for example, the grill or off the stovetop, letting that product rest, letting that cut of meat rest, that's also going to change the eating experience as well. When it's cooked right, grass finished beef, it's just as tender and satisfying. The key here is making sure that you're not rushing that experience. And that's actually going to lead us over into cooking. And so this is another difference between grass-fed. And again, remember guys, I'm using grass-fed here in the conventional way that it's used, how that's often thrown out there now, and it doesn't mean a lot, which is truly not much different than what you're getting with just simply what is labeled as conventional beef. There, you compare that cooking experience against a truly grass-finished animal, and the big idea with this is that you just don't want to overcook the grass-finished product. That grass-finished product, it's generally going to have a bit of a tighter grain in the meat, so the meat fibers are going to be a bit closer together. You'll notice that when you cut into the meat, but that's also because you don't have the same volume of intramuscular fat there coming into the equation. The grain-fed, when you're looking at grain-fed, or let me back up a minute. When you're looking at grass-fed, grain-finished, you can get away with cooking that a bit more. You don't have to let that meat rest as much, and you don't necessarily have to use a meat thermometer. Meat thermometers are always the best way to address cooking. Like you're really trying to dial in your cooking, having a meat thermometer is going to be the best strategy to do that until you've had some experience cooking that meat, so that using a meat thermometer can drastically cut your learning curve here. And honestly, a grain finished animal is more forgiving, is probably the best way to say that. You're not going to have the same narrow window to finish cooking that cut of meat in. You've got a bit more latitude there into how long you cook it, and doing that before it becomes tough or you've overcooked it, right? And that, again, that's all because that fat, that intramuscular fat, cushions that time frame that you can cook within. However, when you look at grass finished, right? So that animal that eats forage from start to finish, from day one all the way until they're harvested, you have to keep in mind that this is going to cut your cooking time down. And you may want to use initially, just to get familiar with this, you may want to use, for example, ground beef, make some hamburgers so you have start to have some familiarity with how it cooks. You could go there into roast. Roasts do give you a lot of latitude, especially if you're slow cooking those, and then transition to steaks. The steaks are the one that are going to potentially be overcooked the fastest, and it can get the toughest most easily. So that's the reason I'm suggesting not starting there when you're getting familiar with cooking grass-finished animals or grass-finished cuts of meat. The other thing that you can do here is, again, use that meat thermometer. That's your cheat tool, if you will. But you could also make sure that you're cooking at a lower temperature. Again, just to give yourself a little bit of a safety zone there. You can use techniques like I've talked about in other videos called a reverse sear, where you cook at a lower temperature knowing that you're not cooking at the same heat that you would with conventional, and then you pull it out, and if you just want the outer portions of the meat cooked really well, you can just quickly sear it in a very hot pan for, say, 30-45 seconds, and you've got the meat finished. But then there's also, if you want to just add maybe more of that, what you might be accustomed to with having some additional fat there, you can always add in butter. Tallow, of course, makes sense since it's coming from cattle anyway, but that's something you can add on and just let that melt into the meat, and that will give you maybe some of the familiarity that you've previously been accustomed to. What about when it comes to buying grass-fed, again, that has probably been grain-finished, versus actually buying a grass-finished, forage-only animal? And these are some of the things that you would want to ask as the consumer when you're buying these products. If you're looking at a label or a website and you would think about seeing terms like grass-fed in the store, or maybe you see this on a label that is on a website somewhere, when you see that, the immediate question you have to ask yourself is, if that says grass-fed, then I need to know how that animal was finished. Was it grain finished at the end? And if the answer to that is yes, then it's not grass finished, obviously, and it's not a truly grass-fed product as that term was originally intended to mean. That's not what you're looking for. You want to know that cut of beef was grass finished on pasture, right? It was out there eating its normal forage. The other thing that can give you some insight into this is knowing what the origin of the meat was. For example, what country is it coming from? Is it coming from Australia? Is it coming from South America? Those are the two other continents that are going to supply beef coming in from out of the country. So I would definitely want to know where that meat is coming from. Any transparency, where's it being processed at? That's the other thing you need to know. Any transparency on where it's being raised at, what processor it's being handled at, those are all things that are going to give you insight into that chain of transparency that can tell you if that animal was truly grass-fed and grass-finished. Now, if you want a truly grass-finished product that is forage only, you cannot just depend on this 100% grass-fed, Okay, if you see that on a label, don't get sucked into it's 100% grass-fed, because you don't know that unless, again, there is a certifying agency there on that label as well that is validating that. And honestly, I'm just thinking of times that I may go through a grocery store. I go and I humor myself on sometimes just to see what kind of games are being played on these labels. And there's not a certifying agency on there. They'll just tell you, it'll say they'll put a USDA organic on there. But again, that doesn't tell you that, it doesn't give you the insight into the finishing process on that animal. The other thing you would want to know about if you're really trying to stick to if you're really trying to stick to grass finished, is you want to know about the winter feed. Because you don't have that grass growing in the warm season, like in the winter, like you do during the warm season, and your pastures are dormant, the immediate question is, well, what are you feeding that animal? If you're feeding hay or baleage or stockpiled forage that's out there in the pasture, maybe there is enough of that they can still work on, then okay, that qualifies as grass finished. But if that animal is being given, say, a silage that is derived from corn versus derived from forage, well, that's different. Now you've got exposure to the grain in that corn silage. And this is not me just being nitpicky. Like, this is an actual differentiation that the American Grass-Fed Association makes. And again, you have to know what that animal is being fed in the winter. Another way that winter feed can be a problem here are what are called lick tubs. These are tubs that are energy tubs that are given to cattle in the winter months to help them along for maybe what the forage doesn't have at that time of year. And those can include grain products in them as well. Now, not all of them do. Most of the conventional ones do, but those are also available that don't include grains as well. So you have to ask a few more questions there. When it comes to processing, I generally would suggest asking that if it's being processed at a USDA facility, USDA certified facility, ask about the facility. Ask about how far that animal is being transported. Ask about what the packaging process is. Is it being vacuum sealed? Is it deep frozen? I mean, these are all things that are going to affect the final quality of the product that you purchase. And if you're eating grass-fed, you want to be attentive to these things and know that as soon as that animal is harvested, as soon as that meat is cut, then you are getting a vacuum sealed product that is preserving that product. Think about that in comparison to what you get when you walk into a grocery store where it's already thawed out. There are changes that are taking place there when that product is thawed out. So ask for the transparency, have conversations with the farmer, rancher, try to build that bridge with them so that when it comes to wanting to know about grass finished, you've got somebody you can immediately turn to help you answer those questions. Now, I felt like in concluding this video that there are a couple of quick myths that I need to dispel. So myth number one here is that all beef is grass-fed, so that label is meaningless. Well, early in life, yes, as I alluded to earlier, you do get all these animals are grass-fed, right? So that's where this whole definition gets murky at. But the finish is where the difference is at. That last 3 to 6 months is where you see the biggest difference at. So you want to ask specifically about grass finished. Do not trust labels. If I can really leave you with anything, it's don't trust a label. Have a conversation and build a relationship with who you're buying your meat from. That's truly the only way you're going to know these answers. Another myth here, and I would definitely say this is a myth. This is probably the biggest one, is that all grass-finished beef is going to be tough. It's always tough. That is not the case. That is an absolute misnomer. There's multiple factors that affect that, but just in general, that has not been our observation at Harvest Hills Ranch. When I talk to other ranches and get feedback from customers, that is not the perception from customers that are out there routinely buying truly grass-finished beef. It's not that it's tough. I think that has been perpetuated, and as a result of it, many individuals have been dissuaded from buying grass-finished meat because they think they're going to have a poor eating experience. Do not let that dissuade you. There's many things that influence this, as I suggested, and you need to find out, tell me about the animals. Like, ask the farmer and rancher about the specific animals. Ask them about the toughness. Like, just go have this conversation with them and see what response you get. But as a general rule, all grass-finished beef is not going to be tough. So don't let that dissuade you or stop you from making a purchase for grass-finished beef. And I would say the last one, just to kind of tie this in with the first one, is that a label tells me what I need to know. Guys, I will leave you with this, that labels vary across the board, but a conversation with a rancher, farmer is going to give you clarity. You can see their facial expressions. You know when someone is blowing a line of smoke at you, when they're not being honest. You can read through that stuff. Our human intuition tells us this stuff. You do not have any clue about that when you're looking at a label. And keep in mind, and this may be the most important thing I say in this whole video, is that labels aren't for transparency. They are for persuasion. And if you keep that in mind, you will not be misguided by what you see on a label. You'll be able to not just look at that label and make an immediate decision. You'll be able to think more thoroughly through your buying process. Now you know, grass-fed is the story, but grass-finished, well, that's the ending that actually matters. And if labels have ever left you confused, well, watch this next video, my straight shooting breakdown of a doctor's viral video on grass-fed label claims that takes a look at what's true, what's missing, and how all these loopholes work. So go ahead and tap that video on the screen, and you'll never read a beef label the same way again.